A 68-year-old widow inherits an abandoned greenhouse after her husband's death, believing it's nothing more than a collapsing piece of land nobody wanted. But beneath the broken glass and dying vines, she discovers a hidden harvest worth over $50 million and a secret her husband protected for decades. What she uncovers next doesn't just change her life. It changes everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and her own strength. Subscribe for more emotional stories like this and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Louise Carter was 68 years old when the people she loved decided her life had already ended. It happened quietly, not with shouting, not with cruelty loud enough for strangers to notice. Just signatures, phone calls, carefully chosen words spoken across polished kitchen counters. 6 weeks after her husband Benjamin passed away, her 2 sons sat her down and explained what they called the practical plan. The family house in Savannah would be sold. The remaining savings would be divided. The debts would be handled quickly before things became more complicated. And the greenhouse? Well, nobody wanted the greenhouse. The old property sat nearly 40 miles outside the city, hidden behind dying oak trees and rusted iron fencing. Years ago, it had once been beautiful. People used to drive for hours to see Benjamin's exotic flowers blooming beneath walls of sparkling glass. But time had not been gentle with the place. Storms shattered entire sections of the roof. The irrigation system failed years ago. Vines crawled across broken windows like nature reclaiming something forgotten. To Louise's sons, the greenhouse was worthless, an expensive corpse waiting to collapse, so they gave it to her. "You can stay there for a while," her oldest son said carefully, avoiding her eyes, "until you figure things out." As if a woman who had spent 43 years building a family suddenly needed permission to exist inside her own life. Louise didn't argue. That was the strange thing. She simply nodded, folded her trembling hands in her lap, and listened to her children erase her future one decision at a time. Because grief does something peculiar to people after a certain age. It doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as silence. And that silence followed Louise all the way to the greenhouse 3 days later. Rain fell steadily as her old station wagon rolled down the cracked gravel road leading to the property. The windshield wipers squeaked weakly against the glass, barely keeping up with the storm. When the greenhouse finally appeared through the fog, Louise's chest tightened. The place looked smaller than she remembered. Older. Tired. Entire glass panels were missing from the roof. Wild ivy strangled the outer beams. One side of the structure leaned slightly inward, as though even the building itself had grown exhausted from holding everything together for too long. For a moment, she simply sat there gripping the steering wheel. Alone. No husband beside her, no children following behind, no certainty waiting ahead. Just an old woman and a dying greenhouse nobody wanted. But then something strange happened. As lightning flashed across the dark sky, Louise noticed a faint golden glow deep inside the greenhouse. A light? Soft? Steady? Impossible. Because the electricity had supposedly been shut off months ago. Louise frowned slowly. And for the first time since Benjamin's funeral, she felt something other than grief. Curiosity. Louise barely slept that first night. The rain hammered against the cracked glass roof for hours, and every gust of wind made the old greenhouse groan like it was remembering its age. She lay awake on a narrow cot inside the tiny office Benjamin once used, wrapped in one of his old flannel blankets that still carried the faint scent of cedarwood and soil. That smell nearly broke her, because for a moment, it felt like he was still there, standing somewhere nearby with dirt on his hands and that quiet little smile he always wore whenever he was hiding a thought he hadn't shared yet. Louise stared at the ceiling until dawn finally softened the darkness, and when morning came, she made herself a promise. She would clean the greenhouse before deciding whether to leave it behind forever. No dramatic plan, no sudden hope. Just one last act of respect for the man she had loved. The air outside was cold and damp as she stepped into the main greenhouse, carrying a rusted shovel and an old pair of gardening gloves. Water dripped steadily from broken ceiling panels. Dead vines tangled around metal beams overhead, swaying softly whenever the wind slipped through the shattered glass. The place looked exhausted, like it had been grieving too. Louise moved slowly through the rows of abandoned planting beds, clearing debris one handful at a time, broken pots, fallen branches, rotten wooden trays swollen from years of moisture. Hours passed. Her back ached, her knees trembled, but she kept going. Because something strange happened every time she considered stopping. She would remember Benjamin's hands. Strong, careful, patient. The way he used to touch every leaf like it mattered. And somehow that memory kept her moving. By late afternoon, Louise had cleared enough debris to uncover the old central walkway running through the middle of the greenhouse. That was when she noticed it. Warmth. Very faint, but unmistakable. Louise frowned. The greenhouse should have been freezing. The heating system had stopped working years ago. Her sons had made sure to mention that repeatedly while discussing how financially irresponsible the property had become. Yet as she stood there, she could feel heat rising beneath her feet. Her heart slowed strangely, then quickened all at once. "No," she whispered softly. She crouched carefully and pressed her palm against the cracked concrete floor. Warm. Not everywhere. Just one section. Louise immediately pulled her hand back as if the floor itself had startled her. For a long moment, she simply stared. Then she stood up and looked around the empty greenhouse. Silent rows, broken glass, dead plants. And beneath it all, something alive. The realization sent a chill through her chest. Benjamin had hidden things before. Not affairs, not lies. Just projects. Little mysteries he carried quietly until the right moment arrived. Over 43 years of marriage, Louise had learned something important about her husband. The quieter he became, the more important something usually was. She grabbed the shovel and tapped the floor lightly. Clink. A hollow sound answered beneath the concrete. Louise froze. Tapped again. Clink. Not solid. Hollow. Her breathing became shallow now. Slowly, she brushed aside dirt and dead leaves covering the area. Beneath years of grime, faint metal edges began to emerge from the floor. A seam. Perfectly straight. Impossible to notice unless you were standing directly above it. "Oh my God," she whispered. A hatch? Someone had built a hatch beneath the greenhouse floor. And suddenly, Louise remembered something she hadn't thought about in years. Benjamin locking the greenhouse late at night. Phone calls he used to take outside. Invoices he never explained. The months he claimed the business was struggling while somehow still paying every bill on time. At the time, she had ignored it. Marriage teaches people not to question every silence. But standing there now, those memories no longer felt ordinary. They felt connected. Louise's pulse pounded harder as she knelt beside the hidden door and searched for a handle. Instead, her fingers brushed against something colder. Metal? A keypad. Old-fashioned, industrial, still faintly glowing beneath the dirt. Her breath caught. The electricity wasn't off. Not completely. Someone had kept power running down there this entire time. And suddenly, the greenhouse no longer felt abandoned. It felt protected. Louise slowly stood up, her mind racing faster than she could process. "What were you hiding from me?" "Benjamin," she whispered into the silence. At that exact moment, headlights swept across the greenhouse windows. Louise startled and turned quickly toward the driveway as an old pickup truck rolled through the front gate. A man stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, weathered denim jacket, gray beginning to creep into his beard. He removed his cap slowly when he saw her. For a second, recognition flickered across his face. "Louise Carter," he asked carefully. Louise blinked in surprise. "Yes." The man nodded once. "I'm Ethan Brooks," he said. "I used to bring equipment deliveries out here years ago." His eyes drifted past her shoulder, toward the section of floor she had uncovered, and his expression changed instantly. Not confusion. Recognition? Like he already knew something he wasn't supposed to know. "You found it," he said quietly. Louise's stomach tightened. The greenhouse suddenly felt much larger, much quieter. And for the first time since Benjamin died, She realized her husband may have taken secrets to the grave that were far bigger than she ever imagined. Ethan stood just inside the greenhouse entrance, rainwater dripping slowly from the shoulders of his jacket. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Louise could hear the distant rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the trees, but inside the greenhouse, the silence felt heavier than the storm itself. "You found it," Ethan repeated quietly. Louise instinctively stepped in front of the hidden hatch. "I don't know what you're talking about." But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. Ethan noticed. His eyes lowered briefly toward the exposed seam in the concrete floor before returning to her face. "Benjamin told me this might happen someday," he said carefully. "Just didn't think it'd happen like this." Louise's chest tightened. "You knew my husband?" Ethan nodded once, more than most people did. The answer unsettled her immediately. Because after 43 years of marriage, Louise had believed there were no parts of Benjamin left unknown to her. And now, standing in the middle of a dying greenhouse beside a hidden underground hatch, she wasn't sure she had truly known him at all. "What is this?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. Whatever lay beneath them was serious. Finally, he exhaled slowly and removed his gloves. "Benjamin wasn't just growing flowers out here," he said. Louise stared at him. "I figured that much out already." A faint smile touched Ethan's face, but it vanished quickly. "There were companies interested in his work years ago," he continued. "Big ones, pharmaceutical groups, agricultural investors, people with money powerful enough to make problems disappear." Louise frowned. "What work?" Ethan looked around the greenhouse carefully before answering, as if old habits still controlled him. "Hybrid cultivation," he said quietly. "Rare medicinal species. Plants most people thought couldn't survive outside controlled research labs." Louise shook her head slowly. "No, Benjamin sold orchids. That's what he wanted people to think." The words landed harder than she expected, because suddenly memories began rearranging themselves inside her mind. Benjamin staying awake until 3 a.m, locked filing cabinets in his office, phone calls that ended the second she entered the room, the constant financial pressure that somehow never destroyed them completely. All those years, he had been protecting something, or hiding it. Louise folded her arms tightly across her chest. "If this was so important," she asked quietly, "why didn't he tell me?" Ethan's expression softened then. "Maybe because he loved you?" The answer caught her off guard. "He knew the less you knew, the safer you'd be." Ethan continued. "Benjamin trusted very few people near the end. And you were one of them." Ethan nodded slowly. For a while, lightning flashed outside again, illuminating the greenhouse in cold white light. Louise glanced back down at the hidden hatch. The keypad still glowed faintly beneath the dirt. Alive. "Waiting." "What's under there?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer immediately. That frightened her more than anything else. Finally, he spoke. "I've never seen it myself." Louise looked back at him sharply. "But Benjamin told me enough to understand one thing." His eyes met hers carefully now. "If he left access to anyone," he paused, "it would have been you." The words settled deep into Louise's chest. Not her sons, not lawyers, not investors. Her, for reasons she still didn't understand. Slowly, Louise crouched beside the keypad again. Dust clung to her fingertips as she brushed away years of dirt covering the faded numbers. Most of the buttons were worn smooth from use, except 4. 4 numbers still carried faint scratches around the edges, as if someone had pressed them hundreds of times. Louise stared at them silently. Then her breath caught. She recognized them immediately. February 14th, Valentine's Day. The day she first met Benjamin at a county fair when she was 19 years old. A memory rushed through her so suddenly it almost hurt. Benjamin standing beside a broken lemonade machine, trying unsuccessfully to fix it. Her laughing at him, the way he smiled afterward like he'd already decided something important. Tears blurred Louise's vision unexpectedly. Even now, after all these secrets, he had chosen something personal, something belonging only to them. Her hands trembled slightly as she entered the code. 0, 2, 1, 4. For one terrible second. Nothing happened. Then, click. A deep mechanical sound echoed beneath the greenhouse floor. Louise gasped softly and instinctively stepped backward as hidden locks disengaged beneath the concrete. The hatch shifted slightly upward. Ethan stared at it in stunned silence. "Well," he muttered quietly, "guess he really was waiting for you." Louise's heartbeat thundered in her ears now. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave the hatch closed forever and protect the version of Benjamin she had known all her life. But another part, the deeper part, needed the truth. No matter what waited below. Slowly, she reached for the metal handle. Cold. Heavy. It resisted at first, as though time itself didn't want the door opened. Then finally, it moved. A rush of cool air escaped from beneath the floor. Not stale, not rotten. Clean. Controlled. Artificial. Louise and Ethan exchanged a stunned look. Electricity still hummed faintly somewhere below them. After all these years, something under the greenhouse was still running. Very slowly, Louise pulled the hatch fully open. Darkness stretched beneath them. And then, lights flickered on automatically below. Rows of soft golden illumination awakened one section at a time, deep underground, disappearing into the distance like a hidden world coming back to life after years of silence. Louise covered her mouth. Oh, Benjamin. A steel staircase descended into the earth beneath her feet, and somewhere far below, something was growing. Louise stood at the edge of the staircase, unable to move. The lights below continued flickering awake one by one, casting long golden shadows across steel walls hidden beneath the greenhouse floor. Somewhere deep underground, machines hummed softly with the steady rhythm of something that had never truly stopped working. For a moment, neither she nor Ethan spoke, because both of them understood something now. Benjamin hadn't built a hiding place. He had built a sanctuary. Louise tightened her hand around the cold railing and slowly began descending the stairs. Each step echoed softly beneath her feet. The air changed as she moved lower. Cooler, cleaner, alive. By the time she reached the bottom, her breathing had become shallow with disbelief. The underground chamber stretched farther than she could see. Rows of enormous growing beds filled the room in perfect symmetry beneath suspended lights glowing warm against the darkness. Thick green vines climbed upward along steel supports, their leaves healthy and vibrant despite years hidden underground. Nothing down there looked abandoned. It looked maintained, preserved, protected. Louise turned slowly in place, overwhelmed. Oh my God. Ethan stepped down beside her, equally speechless. Benjamin's secret greenhouse was unlike anything either of them had imagined. Glass tubes carried water beneath the floors. Digital temperature panels blinked softly along the walls. Ventilation systems hummed overhead with quiet precision. This wasn't a hobby. This was decades of work. Then Louise saw the plants themselves. At first glance, they resembled ordinary vegetables and herbs. But the deeper she walked into the chamber, the stranger they became. Dark blue strawberries hanging beneath silver leaves, tomatoes nearly black in color, delicate flowers that glowed faintly beneath the artificial lights. And in the center of the room, one section stood completely isolated behind thick glass walls, locked. Inside grew a single field of deep crimson plants unlike anything Louise had ever seen. Their leaves shimmered almost like velvet beneath the lights. Ethan stopped walking immediately. His face lost color. "Good Lord," he whispered. Louise looked at him quickly. "What is it?" Ethan stared through the glass. "I saw sketches once," he said quietly. "Years ago. Benjamin never showed the real thing to anybody." Louise's pulse quickened. "What are they?" Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "Red Winter?" The name meant nothing to Louise, but the fear in Ethan's voice did. "They're medicinal," he continued softly. "Extremely rare. Some people thought the species disappeared decades ago." Louise stepped closer to the glass enclosure. The plants moved gently beneath hidden ventilation currents, almost breathing in the artificial light. "Beautiful," fragile, dangerously valuable. Then she noticed something mounted beside the sealed room. A framed photograph. Benjamin, younger, smiling, standing beside the same crimson plants many years earlier. And beneath the photograph, a handwritten note. If you're seeing this, Lou, it means I ran out of time. Louise felt her knees weaken instantly. Her trembling fingers touched the glass frame. Benjamin's handwriting. Still neat, still steady. Like hearing his voice again after death. Ethan quietly stepped away, giving her space as Louise unfolded the yellowed letter tucked behind the photograph. And as she began reading, the entire truth slowly unfolded before her. Benjamin had discovered the red winter species nearly 27 years earlier during a botanical expedition in South America. The plant possessed extraordinary regenerative compounds capable of slowing certain neurological diseases. At first, pharmaceutical companies funded his research enthusiastically, until Benjamin refused to sell them exclusive ownership. That was when everything changed. Contracts disappeared, funding vanished overnight, people began following him. One laboratory fire nearly killed 3 researchers. After that, Benjamin disappeared from the scientific world completely. Or at least that's what everyone believed. In reality, he brought the research home, here, beneath the greenhouse, and for nearly 3 decades he protected it in secret. Not to become rich, but because he believed no corporation should own something capable of helping millions of people. Louise lowered the letter slowly, tears already running silently down her face. All those years, she thought Benjamin had become distant because he loved his work more than his family. But now she understood the truth. He had been carrying the weight of protecting something enormous entirely by himself, and he had done it to keep them safe. Her eyes drifted back toward the final lines of the letter.
Lou!
If anything ever happens to me, this belongs to you now. Not because of what it's worth, but because you're the only person I ever trusted not to lose yourself chasing money. You always saw people before profit. That's why I chose you. I'm sorry for every secret, but loving you was the easiest truth I ever carried. Louise covered her mouth as a sob finally escaped her chest. The grief she had been holding since Benjamin's funeral suddenly cracked open all at once. Not just grief for losing him. Grief for misunderstanding him. For all the nights she believed silence meant distance, when all along, it had meant sacrifice. Ethan stood quietly nearby, his eyes lowered respectfully. After several long moments, Louise wiped her tears carefully and looked around the underground chamber once more. Only now, everything felt different. The greenhouse above wasn't dying. Benjamin hadn't failed. He had protected a miracle beneath everyone's feet, while the world assumed he was simply an aging man losing his business. And now, he had left that miracle to her. Not her sons, not investors, not scientists. Her. Louise stared through the glass at the glowing crimson plants swaying gently in the artificial light. And for the very first time since Benjamin died, she no longer felt abandoned. She felt chosen. Louise didn't leave the underground chamber until nearly midnight. Not because she wanted to stay, because she physically couldn't make herself walk away. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of Benjamin. Handwritten temperature logs, water schedules taped beside glowing control panels, coffee stains on old research papers, tiny pencil marks in the corners of notebooks only she would recognize. It felt less like discovering a secret, and more like stepping into the part of her husband's life he never stopped protecting. The underground greenhouse stretched endlessly beneath the property. Rows of rare plants glowed softly beneath suspended grow lights. Crimson vines curled around steel frames. Dark blue berries hung from silver stems like something from another world. And in the very center of it all, behind reinforced glass walls, grew the red winter harvest. Thousands of deep scarlet plants moving gently beneath warm artificial air. Beautiful. Alive. Worth more money than Louise could even comprehend. But she still didn't understand how much. Not yet. The next morning, Ethan arrived carrying coffee in a small metal case tucked beneath his arm. Louise looked exhausted. She hadn't changed clothes. Her eyes were swollen from crying. But something about her felt different now. Awake. "What's that?" she asked quietly. Ethan set the case carefully onto Benjamin's desk. "Something Benjamin made me promise to keep hidden unless you open the chamber yourself." Louise stared at him. Slowly, Ethan unlocked the case. Inside were folders, legal documents, research contracts, and a thick sealed envelope marked, "For Louise only." Her chest tightened immediately. She sat down carefully before opening it. Inside was a valuation report. Official, stamped, signed. The number printed across the final page made her stop breathing. Estimated market value, $52,400,000. Louise blinked once. Then again, surely she had read it wrong. $52 million. Her trembling fingers tightened around the paper. The greenhouse suddenly felt silent. Too silent. Outside, rain tapped softly against broken glass overhead, while Louise stared at the number that changed everything she thought she understood about her life. Ethan watched her carefully from across the room. "Louise," he said softly. But she barely heard him. 52 million. Hidden beneath leaking roofs, beneath rusted steel, beneath the same greenhouse her sons called worthless. A shaky breath escaped her lips. My God. Ethan slowly pulled out another document. Benjamin was offered nearly 50 million 11 years ago by a pharmaceutical corporation, he explained quietly. And that was before the final harvest stabilized. Louise looked up at him in disbelief. He turned that down. Ethan nodded. He said some things become dangerous the moment money becomes more important than people. Tears filled Louise's eyes instantly, because that sounded exactly like Benjamin. Quiet, stubborn, impossible to change once he believed something mattered. Her eyes drifted back toward the glowing chamber beneath the glass enclosure. All this time, while she worried about grocery bills, while they argued over mortgage payments, while she believed the greenhouse was slowly dying, Benjamin had been protecting a fortune beneath their feet. Not for himself. For her. And suddenly, another realization hit even harder. Her sons had thrown this place away. They handed it to her like unwanted junk. If they had waited just a little longer, if they had cared enough to look, if they had remembered the man their father truly was, everything would have been different. But they didn't. Because greed blinds people long before poverty ever does. Louise lowered the papers slowly onto the desk. For several long seconds, she said nothing. Then finally, she laughed. Softly at first, then harder. Not because anything was funny, but because after months of grief, betrayal, loneliness, life had suddenly become absurd in the most unbelievable way imaginable. Ethan smiled carefully. You okay? Louise wiped tears from her face while shaking her head. No, she admitted honestly. Then she looked around the greenhouse again. At the broken windows, the cracked floors, the miracle hidden underneath all of it. But I think I finally understand something. Ethan stayed quiet. Louise's voice softened. Benjamin never saw this place as failing. Her eyes moved toward the underground chamber glowing beneath the floor. He was waiting for what Ethan asked gently. Louise looked down at the valuation report one final time, then folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope. For me to become the woman capable of carrying it, silence settled between them again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. And somewhere deep below the greenhouse floor, the hidden harvest continued growing quietly in the dark. Worth over $50 million. While the woman everyone believed had lost everything, slowly began discovering just how powerful she truly was. The greenhouse no longer felt like a graveyard. It felt alive. Morning sunlight now spilled through clean glass panels instead of broken shadows. Water moved again through repaired irrigation pipes with a soft, steady rhythm that Louise had started thinking of as the heartbeat of the place itself. And somehow, the sound healed her. 3 months earlier, she had arrived believing her life was ending. Now she woke up before sunrise with dirt beneath her fingernails and purpose pulling her out of bed. The transformation didn't happen all at once. Most days were still hard. Her knees hurt constantly, her hands cramped at night. Some mornings grief still hit her before her feet touched the floor. But grief had changed now. It no longer felt like drowning. It felt like carrying someone beside her. Louise spent nearly every day rebuilding the greenhouse section by section. Ethan helped whenever he could, though more often than not he simply watched her in quiet disbelief. "You know, most people with $50 million would disappear to a beach somewhere," he said one afternoon while helping her install new grow lights. Louise smiled faintly without looking up. Most people probably wouldn't spend their retirement inside a collapsing greenhouse either. Ethan laughed softly. That's true. But beneath the humor, both of them understood something deeper. The money had changed Louise's circumstances, but it hadn't changed Louise. And that was exactly why Benjamin trusted her. The underground harvest remained hidden from the world. Only small portions of red winter were cultivated at a time, carefully monitored using Benjamin's journals and research instructions. Louise refused every large corporate offer that arrived after Ethan quietly contacted a private botanical consultant, and the offers came quickly. Millions, licensing deals, partnerships. One executive even flew in from New York personally. "You're sitting on one of the most valuable agricultural discoveries in modern history," he told her across Benjamin's old desk. Louise simply nodded. Then she asked him one question. "If your mother needed this treatment someday, would you still try to patent it so nobody else could afford it?" The man didn't answer immediately. That told her everything she needed to know. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. After he left, Ethan leaned against the greenhouse doorway, shaking his head slowly. "You just turned down $12 million. Louise continued watering seedlings quietly. "No," she corrected softly. "I turned down becoming someone Benjamin would no longer recognize." Ethan never forgot that sentence. Neither did she. As spring deepened into summer, word slowly spread throughout Savannah about the widow restoring the abandoned greenhouse. At first, people came only out of curiosity. Then they kept returning for something else. Hope. Older couples wandered the pathways on weekends. Retired veterans volunteered to help rebuild sections of the property. Widows brought homemade pies and stories they hadn't shared with anyone in years. Without planning it, Louise created a place where lonely people no longer felt invisible. And perhaps because she understood loneliness so deeply herself, people trusted her immediately. One evening, while closing the greenhouse for the night, Louise discovered an elderly woman sitting alone near the central garden beds. The woman looked embarrassed when Louise approached. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know you're closing." Louise smiled gently. "You all right?" The woman hesitated before answering. "My husband died last winter," she admitted quietly. "I just didn't want to go home yet." Those words struck Louise harder than she expected, because she remembered that feeling perfectly. The unbearable silence waiting inside an empty house after losing the person who filled it for decades. Without saying anything else, Louise sat beside her, and together they watched the evening light fade through the greenhouse glass in comfortable silence. That moment changed something inside Louise permanently, because finally, she understood what Benjamin had truly left her. Not wealth, not power. A second chance at becoming useful to people again. Weeks later, Louise officially reopened part of the greenhouse to the public under a new name. The Carter Conservatory. Not a business. Not a tourist attraction. A sanctuary. A place where people came to remember that life could still grow after devastation. The local newspaper called it the most beautiful comeback story in Georgia. But they still didn't know the real miracle hidden underground. Only Louise and Ethan knew the truth. The $50 million harvest continued growing quietly beneath the restored floors, while above it, something even rarer was beginning to bloom inside Louise Carter herself. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from money, but the kind that arrives when a person finally realizes their life still matters, even after everyone else assumed it was already over. One warm summer evening, Louise stood alone inside the greenhouse after closing hours. Golden light surrounded the flowers. Water trickled softly nearby. Benjamin's old wind chimes moved gently in the breeze overhead. For the first time since his death, the greenhouse no longer reminded her of loss. It reminded her of love that had survived long enough to become legacy. Louise closed her eyes briefly. then smiled through tears, because somewhere deep in her heart, she could finally feel it. Benjamin hadn't left her behind. He had been leading her here all along. By autumn, the Carter Conservatory had become something unexpected. Not famous, not glamorous. Something rarer than that. Necessary. People drove for hours just to walk beneath the restored greenhouse ceiling and sit among the flowers Benjamin once protected in silence. Older couples held hands along the stone pathways. Children laughed beside the koi pond. Louise and Ethan rebuilt together near the entrance. And every afternoon around sunset, the greenhouse filled with golden light so beautiful it almost didn't seem real. Sometimes Louise would stop working just to stand there and watch it. Because after everything she lost, she still couldn't quite believe this life belonged to her now. The article that changed everything appeared online in early October. A national publication picked up her story. The widow who turned a dying greenhouse into a miracle. The photographs spread quickly across social media. Louise standing among glowing flowers. Louise rebuilding shattered windows. Louise smiling softly beside handwritten notes Benjamin left behind. By the end of the week, millions of people had seen her story, and somewhere nearly 3 states away, her children saw it too. Louise was trimming vines near the front entrance late one afternoon when she noticed a black SUV slowly pulling onto the gravel driveway. Her hands stopped moving instantly. Even from a distance, she recognized the vehicle. The engine shut off. Silence followed. Then the driver's door opened. Her oldest son, Matthew, stepped out first. Older than she remembered, more tired, less certain. A second later, her younger son, Daniel, climbed out beside him. Neither of them spoke right away. They simply stood there staring at the greenhouse they once called worthless. Only now, it was beautiful. Restored glass reflected the evening sun like gold. Flowers spilled from hanging baskets along the entrance. Warm light glowed softly through the windows while visitors wandered peacefully through the gardens behind them. The place looked alive. Louise slowly set her gardening scissors down. For a brief moment, old pain tightened inside her chest again. Not anger. Something sadder. The memory of how easily they let her go. Matthew finally stepped forward first. "Mom." His voice cracked slightly. Louise said nothing, because part of her still remembered sitting silently at that kitchen table months earlier while her children divided her life like paperwork. Daniel looked around the property uneasily. "We didn't know," he said quietly. Louise almost smiled at that. No. They didn't know their father spent decades building something extraordinary. They didn't know their mother was stronger than they imagined. They didn't know loss could either destroy a person or reveal them. Matthew swallowed hard before speaking again. "We saw the article." Louise nodded once. I figured. Another silence settled between them. Heavy, awkward, human. Then Daniel finally asked the question both of them had clearly been carrying since arriving. "Is it true?" Louise looked at him carefully. "What part?" "The greenhouse," he said softly. "The business. The money people are talking about." There it was. Not greed exactly, but curiosity tangled together with regret. Louise could see it written all over their faces. The realization that they may have thrown away something priceless. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Louise surprised herself. She laughed softly. Not cruelly, not bitterly. Just tired. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said quietly. Both sons looked at her. The greenhouse was never the valuable thing. Matthew frowned slightly. "Then what was—" Louise's eyes drifted across the glowing conservatory behind them. "My father used to tell me something when I was little," she said softly. "He said some people can stand in the middle of a miracle and still only see dirt." Neither son spoke. Because deep down, they understood exactly what she meant. Tears filled Daniel's eyes first. "We were trying to help," he whispered weakly. Louise nodded gently. "I know." And she did know. That was the heartbreaking part. Her children weren't evil. Just afraid. Afraid of debt, afraid of responsibility, afraid of becoming trapped caring for an aging mother while their own lives moved forward. Fear makes people abandon things they later realize mattered most. Louise understood that now. Matthew looked toward the greenhouse windows shining behind her. You rebuilt all this yourself? Louise shook her head softly. No. Her expression warmed slightly. Your father built this long before I ever understood what he was doing. Emotion tightened visibly across Matthew's face. For several seconds, he couldn't speak at all. Then finally, I'm sorry, Mom. 3 simple words. Late, imperfect, painfully human. But real. Louise stared at her sons quietly while cold autumn wind moved gently through the flowers around them. Months earlier, she imagined this moment differently. She thought if they ever came back, she would want them to feel guilty, ashamed. But standing there now, she realized something surprising. Peace leaves very little room for revenge. So instead of anger, Louise stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her oldest son. Matthew broke immediately. Years of guilt collapsed out of him in a single trembling breath as he held onto his mother like a frightened child again. Daniel wiped tears from his face nearby. And above them all, warm golden light continued shining through the restored greenhouse windows. While far beneath their feet, the hidden $50 million harvest Benjamin spent his life protecting continued growing silently in the dark. But for the first time, Louise finally understood the real harvest her husband left behind. It wasn't money. It was the chance to heal what almost never found its way back home. Sometimes the things people call worthless are simply things they never took the time to understand. Louise lost her husband, her home, and almost her sense of purpose. Even her own children believed the old greenhouse was nothing more than a burden ready to collapse. But hidden beneath the broken glass and dying vines was something extraordinary. Not just a $50 million harvest, but proof that life is not over just because the world stops noticing you. Benjamin understood something most people never do. True value isn't measured by money. It's measured by what remains when everything else is taken away. And in the end, Louise's greatest discovery wasn't the fortune hidden beneath the greenhouse. It was the strength, purpose, and love still alive inside herself. Because sometimes, the most beautiful parts of our lives begin only after everything else falls apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.